Hello and welcome to Bristol Ideas. I'm Andrew Kelly. One of our core themes is the state and future of democracy. I'm joined today by Zsuzsanna Szelényi. Zsuzsanna is Programme Director of the CEU Democracy Institute's Leadership Academy, was a fellow at the Robert Bosch Academy in Berlin, and a member of the Hungarian Parliament for 2 terms, first for Fidesz and then later for Together. Her book, Tainted Democracy, Viktor Orbán and the Subversion of Hungary, is out now from Hearst Books. The Times Literary Supplement called it a masterly new study of the rise of Fidesz and Orbán. Szelényi's Tainted Democracy is detailed and thorough. It offers a rigorous account of how Orbán bent an initially liberal party to his will and how he and his acolytes have subverted institution after institution. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
You remember Fidesz during the transition to democracy in Hungary, and there was huge optimism then as the Soviet Empire collapsed and the Berlin Wall came down. Remind us of the atmosphere of that time in Hungary and how it felt for you.
So Fidesz was established as a youth organization in 1988. It was actually before the wall came down in Berlin. So in Hungary, somehow liberalization within the communist environment already started, and basically because of the economy was shaking, which was of course a reason behind the collapse of the Soviet bloc entirely. So these early times were quite spectacular. There was more and more during the 80s. There were more opening. There was a lot of smaller circles of clubs where you could actually make political criticism. When Fidesz established, this was a big moment because we actually institutionalized opposition. So this was the years of 88. Fidesz was among many organizations of similar kind, but what made it special that it was all young people. And we even had an age limit at 35, so no one could go there. And this was very intentional because we said that what we want is a complete change. We want real democracy with rule of law. There were a lot of law students among Fidesz founders, and human rights and multi-party democracy and elections. Fidesz was, as a youth organization, more radical than others, but also more funny. And it was a real fascinating group of people, somewhat different kind of ideologies which centered in the liberal centrum. And this is where Fidesz established itself 1 year later as a political party.
And I mean, this comes across in your book as well, as does the long-running campaigning for democracy and involvement in intellectual circles and in creativity that your family has had for many decades in Hungary. You talk about 1956, for example, and joining the members of your family joining the demonstrations there for the uprising, but go back right to the 30s as well.
Yes, my grandparents were quite active in intellectual politics. In the 30s, it was different than as we can imagine it's today. It was a very repressive, autocratic period in Hungary between the 2 world wars. So democratic ideas were all in minority and rather intellectual. My parents were at university at 56, and they were very actively participating in demonstration. My grandmother, who was a language teacher, was actually working for the PH, which is a university city, Revolutionary Council. She was their translator towards the Russian Soviet troops and leaders. So it was an entire family participating, which had a lot of consequences. Obviously, later on, some people were imprisoned, and many were basically pushed back in their professional career, which was somewhat easier by the 70s, and when I was born in the late 60s. But this heritage, this legacy, was very strongly with us. Also, and I am also from a religious family, which was rather rare in the time. In communist time, it was not some big deal. So, most people try to just hide if they were coming from religious families. So this gave me a kind of dichotomy when I was a child. I lived in a very friendly, very historically conscious family at home, and I went to school and had friends and read in the newspapers a different reality. And many Hungarians, or I suppose Eastern Europeans, grew up in this environment that you have like two truths in your life, and this was a visible truth and the systemic rule, and of course that you had other things which were you were not supposed to speak publicly. Well, this has quite changed in the late 90s when Fidesz was established, and of course everything has changed at 1989 and 1990 when we had the first free multi-party elections in Hungary.
So you were elected in 1990, I think, as a member of the,
yes.
the parliament. Fidesz in 1988 and in that early period was very different to the Fidesz of today, just as Orbán is very different to the Orbán of 1988. Liberal campaign for reform, now kleptocracy. What's been the shift there? What was Orbán like at the beginning, and and why has he turned into the man he's like today?
So Fidesz starting to change already when we got into the parliament, because politics become more real. It turned out its competitive phase, which we did not see so much. I mean, previously we were all fighting the many parties against the communist system, so that was somewhat, more black and white. When we got to parliament, there were more parties, there were various ideologies, there were various new interest groups were coming to the scene. So parties become more complex, and Fidesz become more complex and more competitive as well. And obviously when the party was professionalizing, we got status being in parliament. We also received funding, buildings. So these resources were part of the power struggle. And Orbán was probably the first of all of us who realized that this is you can make big power if you start to dominate finances and decision-making processes. So he was much more conscious in pushing for political and powerful positions within the party. And it took a couple of years until somehow political ideas also crystallized in the party, and we also learned that we are not unified. Some people like me and many others felt safe and at home in the centrist liberal ideas. I think it was kind of like the Lib Dems in Britain. But there were people who were more on the right. There were more as well. Basically, Orbán, I think, when he gathered more positions, and first he was elected as faction leader, and then he was elected as a party president in 1993. He started to very consciously and fast centralizing the party in terms of positions, competencies in the hand of the party president, access to party financing. So these may basically, by the mid-90s, provided Orbán quite a big power within Fidesz, much bigger than what he had at the beginning. And also his political strategy was different from the original Fidesz strategy, which was very much on the center. He probably thought that he could make Fidesz a bigger party on the right. And this was also possible because the first coalition government, right-wing coalition government, got very fractured after the death of the Prime Minister József Antal in 93. So there was a demoralizing right, and I think Orbán thought he could be more at home there. So he pulled the party to the right. That moment, a lot of people, including myself, left the party because we were not able to counter this move. So Orbán became even more powerful within Fidesz because a lot of his critics left the party. And then ever since, I think by the 1998, when a Fidesz-led coalition got into the parliament, he made extra effort to consolidate the right. A lot of smaller parties were basically eaten up by Fidesz, oftentimes with very radical means, what he used, including secret services and other financial means. So that was not a very nice process, but definitely was successful. And by 2000, Orbán was unquestionably the leader of the right in Hungary, which was then balanced by the Socialist Party, which was the other big party. There was also a Liberal Party, which Fidesz was not any longer. And there were changing every 4 years in government in Hungary. So it was quite a balanced system. And this was still the time when Hungary was looked as a fascinating success story of the regime change. It looked very stable. But of course, we knew about some problems. For example, Hungary, despite being a multi-party country, had a very majoritarian election system. So over the time, there were two major blocs led by one big party, and this favored Fidesz as a right-wing party and the socialists very much. So the correction of the system never happened because these two parties were actually not interested. And this has significantly changed when, after the crisis in 2008, the socialist-led government lost badly at the elections in 2010. And because of this majoritarian system, election system we have, one party could gain a supermajority very easily, which was Fidesz. Even more, with 22% of the votes, they received 67% of the political mandates. And in Hungary, this made a big, big difference. I think it would make anywhere else. It's basically a supermajority. And this offered Orbán an incredible big power, which I don't think anyone in Europe can really imagine. This means that one party out of 7 is able to change the constitution, practically do legislation on its own without any counter strength or force from any other party. So basically the political opposition is there in parliament, but it's very formal and it has very little power. It basically just, speaking, but not really have any influence. So from that point, Orbán started an experiment with Hungary, I would say, an illiberal experiment. Basically, he declared that this is a different kind of democracy. It's not a liberal democracy any longer. The leading party has won the election, so they have the right to do whatever they want. And he actually started to do whatever he wanted, including very specific and targeted legislation to favor certain monopolistic companies, changing the entire structure of the Hungarian business arena. This is a rather small country, not too many rich people. Typically, since the regime changed, capital accumulation was happening through rent seeking. So companies which were close to the government and received big road building, constructions, city building. I mean, this is how people could make big money. Otherwise, Hungarian economy was very much supported by FDI, and a lot of foreign companies came to this country and this region altogether. So he started to build up new Hungarian companies. He called them national entrepreneurs, but these were all his friends, and or maybe even middlemen serving for him. So So that there was dramatic changes in the constitutional environment, in the business environment, in the media environment, in the culture and education, and all the state positions within 3 years after Orbán came to power in 2010 were seated by people close to him. So Hungary looks like a proper democratic institution system, but practically it doesn't work like this because institutions do not fulfill their roles. For example, the public prosecutor never really starts anti-corruption investigation for anyone who is around the government. The competition authority doesn't make monitoring processes when one company receives monopolistic support from the government. So it's quite an absurd state. And well, this is how we are existing now for like more than a decade.
I want to go through some of those changes that were made in a little more detail, but just coming back to a particular point, which is the adoption of the fundamental law in 2011. That's basically the constitution, isn't it? Which keeps being amended time after time, but can only be amended if there's a supermajority in operation. Is that right?
Yes, it's actually requires supermajority to be amended, but except 3 years, Orbán had this supermajority in the last 12 years, and partly because he can also change the election law. So, for example, when I was running in 2014, they changed the law 1 year earlier, and they made it very unfavorable for smaller parties. And when for example, 2018, the opposition parties started to cooperate and create larger alliances, because the winner-takes-all system requires that in each constituency, one person is competing with another. If there are more people competing with one Fidesz person, they all would definitely fail. So cooperation is a critical issue for the opposition. Then there were other changes in the election law, which basically disincentivized cooperation, basically financially. So if you cooperate with others, you had to pay back the campaign support money from the state, which is quite a nasty thing. It's not a big change, but it's good enough to destroy the entire strategy of the opposition. And this is happening again and again. And over the time, this election system become even more majoritarian. It's more majoritarian than the British system. So it even compensates the winner. So if you are the winner party, you get even more mandates in parliament. So it's quite extraordinary. So Orbán can maintain the supermajority, the constitutional supermajority, with actually less number of votes. So it's a very, very deeply distorted system by now.
And when you go through in the book the various methods that have been used, this kind of long march through the institutions, creating this, if there's an authoritarian playbook for this kind of democratic face, but kleptocracy underneath, it's been achieved in Hungary, I think. And you've mentioned a few of them already, but one significant thing that comes over throughout the book and throughout wider reading and watching is how Orbán controls almost like politics and the economics of the country.
Yes. So basically, the Orbán's mindset. I mean, he gave a speech which was not it was an internal speech, but it came out later, when in 2009 he basically said that if you win once a big in Hungary, you can change everything. And this is exactly what he's doing. So the most important thing for repeating the victory is also to disrupt the opposition and basically eliminate any other larger power circle which would in any way endanger his political power. So this is why there's this very deep intervention in the financial and business sector, so that he pushed down a lot of businessmen and he created new ones. And now he's based on this is new people, and then these these financial circles can buy power stations and airplane industrial bases and nuclear power stations and railway systems. So this is extraordinary power. It's all from government funds. These are not business people who are using their own money investing. They all work from government funding. So it's a very, very problematic and seriously controversial issue. The other thing is the media environment. So obviously, until there is free media, that a message control is not really possible. But Orbán system, they were very conscious on media dominance. And while there is free and independent media in Hungary today, their voice is very low. And the state media, national TV channels, radio channels, the news agency, the central news agency are heavily, it's not even just pro-Fidesz or pro-government, they are even the most propaganda media which one can imagine, let's say the Fox News. So it's full of fake news, it's full of conspiracy theories, it's just unimaginable. They also bought up a significant part of the commercial media, televisions, online media. Basically, all the significant online media, news media, was bought up forcefully in the last couple of years. So everything what I was reading 5 years ago, I cannot read any longer because it's now edited by the Fidesz media conglomerate. So if you want to know, something else, what the government is saying, you really have to dig out from the noise which this government is producing. It's not just the normal media. There are actually continual political campaigns. So imagine like a Brexit campaign in Britain. We do have it 4 times a year. So it's an all the time. It's not just incredible noise, but it's also very, very expensive. And this goes under namely of the government. The government uses state budget and the party is all one. But basically, what is the important thing is that Orbán doesn't let any other power circle to grow up. For example, if there is a politician who comes up in the opposition or even in civil society, just someone who is very popular, they really destroy the person with a smear campaign. And sometimes it goes for years and years. So it's a very tough regime.
I mean, that's one of the many checks and balances on power that we normally have in a democratic society. You talked about others, the impact on the constitutional court, for example. What about education? Because, being a journalist, trying to be a free journalist in Hungary must be difficult, but also being an academic as well who wants to pursue free inquiry.
Well, the education system is a target of this regime since the beginning. First, it was the public education. This was already centralized in 2011. This means that while previously the cities and municipalities were responsible to maintain schools, this was centralized by a huge governmental agency. And now each and every teacher in Hungary is employed by this governmental agency. So this, at first sight, doesn't necessarily look dangerous. There are some other countries where education is centralized, but if you have such a power-minded government where it's not about quality of education, but mainly about control and controlling, for example, teachers, that is very powerful. And over the years, we realized that they also changed the curriculum, which become more ideological. Recently, I mean, the last couple of last year's scandal was about how, genders should be demonstrated. But many of these things are made up stories because there is no gender propaganda in Hungary. So when they speak about this, is just a game, an ideological game, and also just a moral campaign. So basically, the school system is by now demonstrating huge failures. For 2 years, teachers are on the street continually. I know that this is a similar case in Britain. I was just in London a couple of weeks ago, and I participated on Parliament Street on a big demonstration. And actually, the stories were very much the same. So it's salaries, but it's working conditions. Mm. It's about how we think about the role of the education system, how much children focused they are, what is in the curriculum, whether the curriculum prepares these children for a kind of very unknown future. So this is very similar problems. But the thing is that in Hungary, if you go to the streets, like our Hungarians, well, first of all, there's no strike possible in Hungary. So many teachers who went on strike, which wasn't the case in Britain, they were fired from their positions. Mm. And then also a larger demonstrations were called, like these are like manifestation of some kind of liberal global conspiracy. So teachers are really frightened to speak up. And at the same time, the new reform, which the Minister of Interior, which is now responsible for education, this is another nonsense, is announced a reform which would basically take money away from teachers if they are not producing good enough results. So while the problems are similar than in many other countries, the government response demonstrates its autocratic format. With the academia, this has also went through very significant change. The research institutions of the Hungarian Scientific Academy were all centralized into one network. New leaders, directors are nominated to the tops of these institutions. Obviously, somewhat try to control scientific content, which is not so visible yet. But obviously, it takes time until the takeover. And what probably one of the most outrageous is that most of Hungarian state universities were organized in a form of private equity foundations, somewhat called like it's foundations which serve the public. It's a new legal entity which they figured out, and then they put all their cronies and politicians into the board and senate of the universities, which is one of the issue now the European Union is questioning. But basically, it's again a really distressing element of basically changing elite in Hungary. I mean, it's definitely the effort. I'm not sure whether this is possible actually, but this is the aim what this regime wants to control ideas and because knowledge is also power. So everything what is power is important for the system.
And in recent years, you've seen these attacks on George Soros, for example, on international finance, which moves over into anti-Semitism sometimes.
So the anti-Soros propaganda is basically serving that Hungary for Orbán has to fight some enemy. Well, the autocrats, and it's not only autocrats, populist autocrats, and all of the current 21st century autocrats are populist, unlike the 21st century autocrats. They always have to demonstrate this fight against an enemy. And since Orbán has no enemy in Hungary, he's the strongest person for 12 years, that he could just basically, there's no enemy. He has to look for this enemy elsewhere. So oftentimes this is the European Union, but someone like George Soros is much better enemy because first of all, he is not visible. He's an old man and he definitely exists and has his foundation and supports liberal democracy and open society, but he doesn't do anything what Orbán is telling he or his network is doing. So he's also American. You know, Eastern Europeans or Europeans, it's easy to make up a kind of conspiracy which is in the US. It's far enough. A lot of people don't know about it. And also Soros is a Jewish person. However, it's never mentioned, but the visual profile, how he is demonstrated on posters, for example, as a kind of arch enemy of Hungary, is often reminds people, for example, how in the 1930s Jewish financier business people were demonstrated. So obviously this is a kind of thing what can remind people for anti-Semitism. Well, now the thing is that the anti-Soros propaganda, and I explain in details in this book how it was consciously made up and used by, figured out by American advisors of Orbán and tested and tried in other countries, but basically perfectualized in Hungary, because in Hungary it's the government who can do this, and it has all the means and money to make a huge campaign out of this. It started already in 2014 through attacking some of the NGOs, especially the ones which are checking the government or monitoring the government activities, anti-corruption companies, human rights and NGOs, for example, and then continued with the anti-migration campaign, stating that some kind of global liberal elite is organizing the migrants and pulling them to Europe, and these are supposed to push out real Hungarians out of Hungary and real Christians out of Europe. So obviously this was continually made up. So now, why is it interesting that it is so strong, this narrative, and it can be, as any other conspiracy theory is so strong, that, for example, when teachers go to the street in these days, they are also blamed with being part of this global conspiracy, which is complete nonsense. But it's very, very difficult to counterattack or protect people. And of course, this serves that it's alienate from people from speaking up, to demonstrate, to sign anything. For example, now there is another big issue in Hungary. The government is in a very forceful industrialization process, and they invited Chinese companies to build battery factories in a place in Hungary which is very flat and lacking water. It was really dry in the last couple of years. So it's exactly in a place where there is no water, and the only thing you really need for battery is water. So it's quite a catastrophic industrialization. Now there is a local movement against this, and they already, from the first day they went to the streets, they are accused of being part of this global Soros organized propaganda machine. It's just unbelievable. It's really I mean, people should be very strong to keep sane and just move on if they're really unhappy with something the government is doing.
And then the poison that comes through from that, and also on the attacks on migrants and refugees, has been very significant, I think, in recent months and years. Just one final question on some of these changes. That you also write about the attempts to rewrite the past, about the kind of culture wars in how you memorialize the past, talk about it now, and so on. And that's all been led by, there's the House of Terror you write about, and the National Memorial that was created.
Yeah, well, this is quite a fascinating thing, and I think very, very relevant in practically any countries, because all autocrats are doing this. So the past is important, because this is where we find our role models in in terms of how we behave in the world, it's very much close to our identity building. And it matters what we remember from the past and how we remember of this. So now Hungary's past, like probably every other country, is quite confused. There are good elements and uplifting moments, and there were nasty things. And the Hungarian political elite made incredible mistakes just in the last 200 years, and pushed Hungary to worse and worse decisions historically. And you can face these problems, historic problems, and analyze them and learn from them. But you can also blame others, which is always so easy, and say that we were the true people, and the others were the bad ones, and we were always on our own. We were the lonely ones, and we didn't make any mistake. And this is exactly how Orbán is translating Hungary's history. It's reframing everything we learned, and even not only like the two world wars, where Hungary's role was very controversial, and of course we came out very badly from both world wars in the 20th century, but even reframing the story of 1956, which is quite painful for someone like me, who comes from a family, an intellectual family of 1956, because, for example, he is erasing the communists who were for freedom, because it doesn't fit into his anti-communist right-wing ideology. But he also erasing the intellectuals from this story. He basically presenting 1956 like these were the young people from the street who took up the arms and went against the big regime and almost won. But because of the Western part left us on our own, we failed. So, but even he's trying to reframe the 1989 story, which I don't think is yet possible. I don't think the others are possible either, because I don't think it's so easy to completely retell a story. There are several generations, so it's a big effort, but it's very confusing. And of course, such a big and strong and affluent regime, and I'm saying affluent because Orbán had an incredible luck in the last 10 years. Not just Hungary received an extraordinary fund from the EU, historically measurable free money to develop our country, but also European economy went pretty well before the pandemic. So he had resources to redistribute and to use for propaganda, to buy up companies, and also provide relatively fine life for Hungarians for lucky situations. So his power and his support is there. However, it's not as big as anyone would think.
I mean, there are many lessons from your book for even democracies like this country, where we've been going through our own troubled history on some aspects, particularly attacks on the judiciary and the media, the use of parliament in terms of the Brexit debate and so on, but also in terms of how places understand their pasts as well. I mean, Bristol is a city, for example, which has struggled to come to terms with the fact that it was a leading city for the trade in enslaved people for many, many, many years, decades and in some cases centuries, in fact. So there's much of value there. I want to talk about a couple of other things now. The first is about Hungary's relationship with the West. It's a member of NATO. It's a member of the EU. It relies a lot on the EU for funding and so on. And yet it's begun to look eastward, hasn't it? It looks more to the Soviet Union and to China in some respects now.
Well, Orbán does.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Orbán does. Yeah.
I'm not sure Hungarians do so. I mean, Hungarians all look to the West. This is where we want to join. This is where we want to go. This is where we go for holidays. So it's not a national turn. It's Orbán's political choice, and it has very concrete reasons. And the thing is that, again, his mindset is this power mindset. He only believes in power. So, and he doesn't really doesn't really like any kind of dependencies. He is a personal character like this, and we know that this was like him, like when he was a child. So he was not a very complying person to any kind of rules. So this describes a lot about his relationship to Hungary's Western partners and allies. He knows that it's necessary because this creates Hungary progress, perspective, and security. But he doesn't like it because it limits him. So the Eastern opening, which he announced 10 years ago, was about losing these relationships and building up others in order that he has more room for maneuvering. This is what he likes. And he felt that after the 2008 crisis, somehow the West was not so demanding in terms of compliance any longer, and he actually had it right. So he could really go very far in terms of opening to the East. However, this was not true. For example, trade relations also were not very successful. So it's partly a narrative. Which is about like the decline of the West. I mean, we know this from many autocrats who usually like to speak about the decline of the West. This is very strong in Orbán's political narrative. We cannot build on only the West any longer. It's the East is rising. We have to think for our survival and sovereignty and strengths. We have to look also for the upcoming powers, not only the declining powers. So basically, that's the logic that he explains to people, which again, I think it's only partially goes through Hungarians, but that's what he sells his own voters and his elite. And of course, he uses this relationship for a lot of blurry and untransparent business. So it serves his regime because trading and working together with Western companies should be more scrupulous. There are more strict regulations, but dealing with some Turkish companies or Russian companies, there's a lot of informality. So it also serves his personal or clientele's kind of private rationale, which is very problematic in terms of Hungary's national interests. And this we see also with this war, Russia's war in Ukraine. Orbán's position is very controversial in this regard. And partly, I think this is because there's too much dependency with Russian companies. Many probably we are not even aware of. And that's also kind of political calculation that the Western alliance, which is now backing Ukraine, will not hold on very long. And then he, with his outspoken story of that, there is Russia. There will be a Russia after the war kind of comments, what he often has. He probably hopes that he can be proved to be right. But this is quite a deeply immoral attitude. And I think a lot of Hungarians are really suffering from this position.
And I'm glad you reminded me of the distinction between Orbán and Hungary in terms of looking to the West. I think that's really important. In terms of Hungarian voters, people who voted him and so on, he won the 2022 election. Do you think there's this feeling of powerlessness, that things can't change in the country?
Well, of course, every lost election for at least for half of the electorate who who never vote to Orbán, and of course a lot of people who do not vote for anyone. This is incredibly disappointing and very confusing. And well, I am not active in the Hungarian opposition any longer, but it needs a very severe reflection of what actually is still possible in terms of opposing the regime, and whether it is the parliament and elections what are the moment when this regime can be really countered at one point. So I think this is the situation in these days. The opposition is rather disorganized. There are a lot of power struggles. It's a survival fight for many of them, but well, usually they get together, and there will be elections. European elections next year, 2024, and also we will have municipality elections in 2024. And though the competencies of municipalities were radically decreased in the last 12 years, and this is partly because these are also power centers. I mean, municipalities are led by politicians. It's a governing position, and interestingly, I think Orbán is also worried on his own people who can grow up in a larger city, and a mayor can grow up as a political rival. So it's not only the opposition; it's only his own people. He keeps them in control with limiting the competencies, the budget of the municipalities, which is happening all the time. For example, in the COVID crisis, we had crisis management, emergency situation in Hungary, and a lot of competencies were taken away from municipalities. But anyway, it's still a political position, and it is still important. And well, by the time it comes, the opposition will be all set again. The question whether again and again, whether they find a strategy that they will not be cut independently from each other, but they can come to some kind of cooperative way to run together. That's basically always the trap of the Hungarian opposition. But we'll do that.
I mean, I'm particularly interested in reading about the municipality elections, and particularly the mayor of Budapest, who overcame Fidesz, won the election, went on to form this alliance of a pact of free cities to combat national populism, and indeed renamed a number of streets, didn't he, in Budapest, when there was an attempt to open a branch of a Chinese university in the city.
Yes, well, that's the thing. What you're mentioning is that there is a huge project which so far was not implemented, and this is because of, I think, the war and the economic crisis Hungary is facing. But Orbán basically want to buy a huge Chinese university, Fudan, which is one of the biggest Chinese university. And when this news was leaked, because we know quite issues from the government while leaking documents, there were a lot of demonstrations against the idea, so they really stopped the implementation of the project. And because it's in Budapest, a lot the opposition and civil opposition went to the streets, and they remained the streets for free Taiwan and for the Uyghur freedom and this kind of things, which was a funny act, obviously, but very, very nice. It was a high time for the opposition. But actually, renaming street is a thing in this country and many Eastern European countries, and this is part of how you relate to your past. And well, this is maybe another issue we discuss sometimes, because there's a lot of criticism whether renaming street is really a good thing, and you really have to delete, and who you should delete from history and who you should not. And that's just quite an interesting story.
And that's a very big issue in Bristol. I don't know whether
sure.
we there were demonstrations against a statue which was thrown into the river, and then Colston, who the statue was of, had a number of streets named after him. It was streets, schools, buildings, the main municipal concert hall, and so on. So a lot of those have been renamed since. I mean, this is a big subject for us in our work that we do in our Festival of the Future City, and it would be good to discuss this with you in more detail at another time, I think.
Well, that the only thing what I can say is that you have to speak about this openly. This is what we cannot do, because in Hungary there are no debates. There are no debates. It's a system. It's a government which is declaring things, and there are parallel talks. So there are hardly any debate. They just don't debate anything what they want with the people, and that is, I think, a big difference. One of the big differences Britain has, that until you do have a debate and you have people with various opinions and they sit down with each other, that's something very important.
And I think that's one of the key lessons which comes through when you think about what's happened in Hungary and lessons for democracy elsewhere. Certainly we have seen, not as serious as Hungary, as I pointed out earlier, but we've seen a decline in democracy in this country and problems with democracy over many decades, and it may take many decades to recover the position. Do you think there are general lessons that we can learn about the experience of Hungarian democracy since 1988 that will help us?
So I think the lesson from Hungary is that under given circumstances, it's very easy to lose what you build up. And when you see the first signs of degradation of democracy or backlash, you have to stand up for it, and you have to push this agenda, because there is a global autocratization process. I tell a lot of little stories on the book, which a lot of people can remind their own countries, and not only in Eastern Europe. So this is a problem, and this is a general crisis. It's just too many countries, and the institutions are super important. And Britain definitely has stronger institutions than Eastern European countries, where all these democratic institutions were relatively young, and many of them, and we saw this in Hungary, just didn't maintain the ethos of those institutions. So just a couple of people can completely change the judiciary. That is really demonstrates the weakness of systemic weaknesses. But there are new phenomena, and 21st century autocracies work in very different way from earlier ones. And they can slip into your life, through media. I mean, like BBC stories, media issues are very critical element of this. Also questioning various authorities of the institutions. These are the critical things. So if you see this, happening, you have to watch them and talk about that, and try to change it back for stronger democracy.
And I know you know, sorry?
A democratic resilience, which is a new term. It didn't exist 10 years ago. It is something that we all have to watch out.
Yeah. And looking back at 1988 and the sense of optimism and hope that you had around then, and you write in the book how very recent changes have filled you with helpless anger. Do you still have some hope for Hungarian democracy?
So basically, I don't think that democracy changes is linear. We definitely learned it here in Hungary, but altogether, I believe that the world is moving ahead, and we have the ability to learn from our mistakes. Hungary at one point will get out of the grip of Orbán, because no regime lasts forever. And of course, we don't know how long it will take, because these illiberal systems can be very resilient. But we will learn a lot out of it. And I already see a generation in Hungary who are very much open-minded than many of the political elite in these days, who are basically led by greed and grievances, mainly greed. And I think this is what we have to learn. And I'm traveling around in this region, and the post communist period was really led oftentimes by greed, and now it's grievances. It's a combo which is very harmful, but in the longer term, this is going to change. And I'm not very optimistic, at least not in the short run. I think I become more a realist than I definitely not a utopian, but I basically believe the learning potential of humanity, and I think that will help Hungary as well.
Well, thank you very much. One very good guide to this is Tainted Democracy, published by Hearst Books. It's highly recommended by us. Thank you, Zsuzsanna, for your work and for discussing it with us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was really nice to talk to you.